Welcome back to Mr. Homemaker, where today we're talking about how to form new family traditions as a couple once you've moved past the phase of, hey, we're going to Thanksgiving or Christmas at your family's house or my family's house. Like, no, we have our own home now and we're going to start building our own traditions.
Right.
There is sort of this forming and storming and norming going on in a new home for a couple.
Right.
What are your initial reflections on like how we navigated that or our experience was?
So my most vivid memory of holidays was moving in together and getting our first Christmas tree from the Whole Foods across the street. And going out on our, we had this outdoor patio on our apartment, and you taking a hatchet and a glass of whiskey and going outside and cutting the bottom of the tree off.
It needed to be pruned so it would fit in the tree stand.
I very vividly remember that. But then I think it was, so I feel like for us, Christmas is probably the most tradition, although there are other things too. And I think the cool thing about when you get married is that there are traditions that you will want to hold on to because they are a part of your family. And it's the things you reflect back on warmly that were a part of, of growing up. But then there's also, and it's a really fun time to identify new traditions that you want to bring in that maybe you didn't do. So for us, one thing was around the Easter, I started baking this Easter bread every year with the colored egg in the middle. That wasn't something that my parents did, but I just, it's kind of an Italian tradition. It was something that I saw a lot in the North End when I lived there. It's an Italian neighborhood in Boston. And so it was something that I wanted to bring to us. So we kind of found things that were part of our tradition and then built new ones.
Yeah. I do think that where I see the most tension on people's Reddit posts is when they're like, I'm really into the holidays and my significant other is anti. They had a negative experience with them in childhood and they don't want to participate and it's that creates a lot of friction.
Right.
Or vice versa. The person posting is this is not a big deal to me, but my significant other just has all of these very elaborate, expectations and traditions that create all of this tension.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting, right? Because there are, you are two people coming together to form a new unit and new and unique traditions yourself. And so that is, but you have to also be respectful of what the other person is bringing to the table. I had never thought about that, but if you have if your husband is coming into this, where he didn't have a really good experience, a Christmas experience, maybe parents divorced around that time, or maybe they didn't have a lot, and so Christmas was a very stressful time. Recognizing and talking about and sharing that with one another, I think is really important, because it is, I feel that's something almost insurmountable to getting your partner to where you are.
Yeah.
If you don't stop to realize what is the what is the why behind this and what's driving my partner's anxiety or concern with the holidays, and then working to come together to figure out how you can build something that meets what you both need. And maybe it's a little non-traditional, right? And but making sure that you're not kind of forcing the way you feel and the things you need on your partner.
Yeah. And I think that people sort of take for granted that the person that they fall in love with and move it, they just assume that well, you must also feel the way I do about this holiday. Or it doesn't occur to many people until they're in it of we have totally different expectations and experiences and those kinds of things. And I think that can cause resentment if you're not mentally prepared for marriage to be a place where you're building a new family.
Right.
It's not just a matter of finding a spouse who conforms to is the puzzle piece that fits into your pre-existing puzzle.
Right.
It's that when these two people come together, they are now involved in a joint venture to create new traditions or to distill a family culture out of their two respective families of origin.
And I think this leads to something really interesting because there's kind of different buckets, right? If you are from two different faith backgrounds, the likelihood that our things are going to conflict, it's probably I'm going to go to your family's house for this event and then you're going to come to my family's house. But there can also be challenges with that because if you are married and then you're thinking about having children, the friction will come at the point where you're well, once we have to have a shared choice, right? Like, how do we
Sure.
navigate?
Yeah.
Are we going to be Jewish or Catholic? Are we going to do Christmas or Hanukkah? Are we doing both? What does that look like? So I
Right.
think there's like that piece of it. And then there's the piece of so you're both maybe the same religious background and you celebrate the same holidays, but you have different traditions or your families do it differently. And that gives you some space to navigate. And I think there's the third bucket, which is like, we do things exactly the same, but that causes friction because like both of our families expect us to be with them all the
Participating in both
time. We're
things.
both
Right,
doing like
right.
Feast of the Seven Fishes, right?
Yeah.
And so navigating each of those, I think, is very different.
Sure.
I'm really curious to know, like, what were the weirdest traditions when we came together? Like, what are the things that you were like, what? Your family does what?
Yeah. No,
Like-
the only thing is before you, I had never heard of a Christmas pickle. Yeah, do you want to explain?
Santa takes the Christmas pickle and hides it in the tree
Of course, Santa
on
would do that,
Christmas
yeah.
night, and Christmas Eve, and whoever, after all the presents have been opened, do not be caught looking in that tree while you're sitting there opening presents.
Right.
But when the presents are all opened, then one last present, we find the Christmas pickle, and whoever finds the Christmas pickle, as we got older, it was a Starbucks gift card,
Right.
a very coveted present.
It's really obviously more for the pride.
I could see how that could feel weird.
But the other book that I think is really relevant to this like melting pot or like creating a new family culture,
Mm-hmm.
this process is The Meaning of Marriage by Timothy and Kathy Keller. And the most relevant section from this book is where he talks about, marriage involving becoming a new decision-making unit. And so again, in contrast to like this expectation some people have when they're looking for their spouse, of like, I'm looking for the person who's going to fit into my pre-existing expectations. Once you choose a person, once you're married, you just say, whatever my expectations are, I have to at least be willing to set them aside or compromise on them or let them be replaced, or for us to come up with some new tradition, because we need to make these decisions as a couple and not just like, well, whatever pre-existing expectation I had is now like I'm going to impose on the couple. So
I think that also kind of ties into one other thing, which is, you talked about becoming a new unit. And I think that's really important, not just in how you approach your conversations, but then how you communicate your decisions to the other people that it's going to impact, right?
Right.
Like, the worst thing you can do is be like, well, Marcus doesn't want to come to Christmas because he hates family and Santa, right? Like, but that's like not, that drives what you're doing is you are identifying yourself with your former family, right? And that's where your loyalty lies.
Right.
Whereas when you, like, even if it's hard, right? Even if it's not your first choice, like what you guys have decided.
Yeah.
Talking to particularly your parents, right? As a we.
Well, but also
like,
your siblings.
And your siblings.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we have decided X, Y, Z.
If you're finding this video helpful, please click the like button below so it can spread to other couples. What would you say for a couple who is really trying to establish their own family traditions for the first time? This is their first holiday season of like, we're going to do Thanksgiving at our own home, the two of us, or at least we're going to like wake up here Christmas morning. Like, what kind of things are we going to do? Like, they're navigating those decisions for the first time. What's your number one top tip to help them navigate that?
Open a conversation.
Yeah.
Don't just allow it to be expectations.
Right.
And then be willing to really hear and ask questions of the other person. And if you are being asked questions, don't get defensive, right? Have those conversations about like, what is most meaningful to you? What are the things that are most important? And how are we, and then recognizing like when you have identified, hey, this is actually an area where we may agree, like, and getting really to the challenges, making sure those are kind of fewer once you've talked through, what's most important.
And my top tip would be to embrace the opportunity for the two of you to be creative together. Like, to think of this as because it's not truly a clean slate. It's not like you're coming to it with no expectations. Like, that's not a reality.
Right.
But starting from a presumption of like, well, we could do anything. Mm-hmm. Let's like be excited about the opportunity to like create a new vision together.
Right.
And certainly like part of how we create our vision is we're both going to draw from our actual experiences and like things we wish we had done or we'd like to start doing, starting a new tradition.
Right.
But embracing a mindset and an atmosphere of like creativity and collaboration, and not just like, again, like don't think about it as a win-lose of like, if this isn't exactly like my childhood, then somehow I'm losing to you in some way. It's like, no, it's like we're creating something together.
Right. And as much as I've said, right, be careful of precedent, I think the flip side is you can always change it, right? Like you can decide, maybe you decide like, hey, we do Thanksgiving where we do the, morning and afternoon football game with you, and then we go to your family's house and do the second half of the day. And then you may realize a year or two in, or when you have kids, like it's too much. Like we don't want to split.
Yeah.
And then you just make new arrangements. Now you have to recognize that again, as if you have a larger family, those things impact them too. And so just kind of working through that to figure out what makes the most sense for you. And sometimes recognizing that like it may not make everybody else happy.
Yeah. Well, as you said, the next big milestone is once you go from being a couple to once your first bundle of joy arrives, and you have to start thinking about traditions you're going to establish for your children. So it's good to start creating traditions as a couple so that you can kind of warm up and anticipate. But in our next video, we're going to dive into where I think the rubber really hits the road, is once you start saying, what traditions are we going to set up for our 4-year-old?
Right.
All right, see you over there.